Welcome everyone to the Eureka Centre. I'm Anthony Cam, the manager here, and thanks for joining us tonight for Talking History with Professor Keir Reeves, OAM. And tonight we gather on the land of the Wadawurrung people, and I begin by paying my respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Keir's talk tonight is titled Gleaning the Past, Enduring Legacies of Victoria's Gold Rushes, and is presented on the cusp of the 175th anniversary of the discovery of gold in Victoria. And tonight Keir will reevaluate some of the long-term impacts and legacy of gold in Victoria, and this includes the establishment of instant goldfield cities and towns and their associated multicultural societies, and of course all the institutions, many which are continuing today, businesses, but as well as hospitals, universities, theatres, art galleries, magnificent public gardens, etc. And as well, he'll look at that extraordinary period of technical innovation and industrialisation and economic growth, which has really set this city up for a very strong future. Yet, this period is also requires grappling with the many challenges and consequences of colonisation, the displacement of Aboriginal people, and of course the environmental degradation, which in many ways defines the very landscapes that we live with today. Professor Keir Reeves is a co-director of the Future Regions Research Centre at Federation University Australia. He's also chair in History and Heritage. His current research work at the intersections of heritage, cultural tourism, regional studies and history. And Keir's publications include Deeper Leads, New Approaches to Victorian Gold Rush History from 2008. He also contributed to the award-winning Bruce Skates-led Anzac Journeys. Keir has also completed research extensively internationally, both as a fellow and visiting professor at universities including the University of Cambridge, King's College London and Utrecht University. And most recently, Keir was awarded the OAM in the King's Birthday announcements for his services to tertiary education. So congratulations there, Keir. And indeed. And I think anyone that knows Keir's deep kind of connection to the history and heritage community throughout the region will appreciate that's a well-deserved honour. So just to remind you all to please turn off your devices. There will be questions at the end, and please join me in welcoming Professor Keir Reeves.
Thank you everybody for coming along. Thank you for the warm welcome. It's nice to get a personal accolade, Anthony, but there are a number of people in the room that I think deserve it more than me for service over a very long period of time. Maybe I just didn't offend anybody, but I just wanted to say that I see this as something for the region, for people who are involved in history, heritage, or just think about the regional studies piece. So yeah, it's for everybody, and I really mean that. Anthony just muttered to himself something about the true believers. You are the true believers for coming here this evening when it's so cold and wet. I really expected a very small rollout. When I agreed to do it with a wonderful invitation for Hermione, who's away on mat leave at the moment, daylight saving had just come along. I thought it was all going to be smooth sailing. I'd rock in, it'd be nice, it'd be a light. And then I realised on the way in this evening that it's July and here I am. So once again, thank you all for coming. I really, really, really appreciate it, especially those I know have come from out of town or up from Melbourne and that sort of stuff. I'd also acknowledge a number of old colleagues and friends and former students and people that I sit on heritage committees with and whatever else. So thank you very much. Behind me is a wonderful picture that I didn't select, but it really has got people talking, and it's a detail from Richard Daintree's picture of Black Hill. And I really it's up to emphasise the radical altering of the central Victorian landscape that occurred as a result of mineral extraction. In the most cases, we're talking about the alluvial, I'll talk about that more, but within the surface. And of course that has huge implications for what the land looks like even nearly 175 years later. Just thinking about this slide when it came across my desk as part of the blurb, Daintree was a geologist and a photographer. He lends his name to the Daintree rainforest in Queensland, which is a World Heritage Area and had its own fabled political history, but is best known for many of us in the room for the Goldfields region's photos that he took, having joined Antoine Fauchere's studio in Collins Street, where together they produced the Sun Pictures of Victoria, which comprised of photographic prints of Melbourne, as well as some of the only remaining extant images of the Victorian goldfields, as well as Aboriginal communities from the era. So thank you for the slide, thanks for putting it together, and I think it's piqued a number of people's interest. So also, thanks particularly for the invitation to speak this evening, Anthony. I'd like to particularly acknowledge the work of Carly and Hermione, who I said is on maternity leave, as well as Anthony, the director. I'm delighted to be here at one of the pathways, the Eureka Centre, one of the pathways or gateways to the goldfields. This evening, I'm going to briefly talk about the experience of the Victorian gold rushes from 1851 onwards, and also the significance of the mid-19th century era that was central for Victoria's subsequent history. As the promotional blurb suggests, perhaps the key legacy of the gold rushes was their ability to enrich and transform society, but also, as Anthony noted in the opening, with challenging consequences. This includes the establishment of instant goldfield cities like Ballarat, Bendigo and Melbourne, I would argue, the network, the close network, one of the closest settlements in Australia, the network of towns and villages that emerged where they're associated multicultural societies. That technological innovation piece that comes from the transfer from Europe and other places and mining techniques, as well as the economic transformation that occurred. There's seats down the front on the far side if you need to. So let's be clear, such a radical transformation of society also had major implications for the environment, as we can see from Black Hill. I mean, you can still see it's behind me, in front of you. You can still see the legacy today. You could read this landscape, not as obviously as denuded as is there, but certainly you can make out what's happened, and the extent of what's occurred is incredible. So it means today, despite all the rain, many perennial creeks throughout the region still don't flow nearly 175 years after the rushes, and this is due to the sedimentation that occurred. Okay, so I've just put this up. This is from Robin Annear's Nothing But Gold book with permission from her. So that's got the Castlemaine-centric thing, but I want you to look at the big map, and just to get at your bearings, we're talking about Buninyong, Ballarat and Clunes, the early stages of the rushes, Mount Alexander, Castlemaine as it's known, a bit further to the northeast, Bendigo that followed soon after, as well as the Ovens goldfields and up around Beechworth where the rushes ended 10 or 15 years later. I think the reason Robin put in Anderson's Creek is because that's where gold was found as close to Melbourne as possible, and I know people in the room will be aware of that. And of course Geelong, the pivot, the second city, you can't really talk about the gold rushes without considering the roles of Geelong as the port and also Melbourne. So just to give you your bearings. But before I do, I want to take us back in time to the second half of the 19th century. One enduring legacy that I would like to highlight is the role of museums and galleries, such as the Eureka Centre, genealogical and local historical societies, libraries, traditional owner organisations, regional cultural institutions, local government, the tourism offerings such as Sovereign Hill and others, as well as operators and festivals such as the South Street of Stedford or the Andersons Mill Heritage Festival, as well as local businesses who have their roots in the gold-seeking era. Say Ballarat, for instance, Cameron's, the plumbing supply business, or I know of a heritage architectural firm that goes back to the Bryant family to the very first days of settlement in central Victoria. So these organisations, they tell stories of individuals, families, wealth creation, and how endurance, and how communities have come together in the Goldfields region. And I think they help us to remember the legacies of the era for better, mostly better or worse in the present day. I'm mindful that other people in this series have explored this theme, but I think it's worth reiterating how important. And I think the turnout tonight is indicative of the interest that the community holds so much. So I guess I'm here to give a keynote, I suppose, but really I see it as a community conversation where so much knowledge resides in the community. So it's fitting that we're here at the Eureka Centre. It is a cradle of Australian democracy. It's also situated one of the key former routes to the central Victorian goldfields. And I'm not sure how much you can make this out, but this is I picked this up on Trove. This is the map to the gold rushes, so this tells you all the various routes. Yeah, and then the middle one you're fording in Bacchus Marsh, which would have been the route to the Ballarat diggings. Many of you will know that. And then this other picture, which is the carriage with a number of Chinese gold seekers, and this has been claimed for so many different things, but my understanding it is people departing to go to the New Zealand rushes. But it just speaks to us of the different and circuitous routes that people took to get to the goldfields, and also how challenging it was. So these people in these pictures and the route that's outlined in the map, they just tell the story of the many of thousands of people who ventured the goldfields, came via Bacchus Marsh, Balan, or took that alternative route that is now the Geelong-Ballarat or Ballarat-Geelong Road. They were all travelling initially en route to the Golden Point diggings not far from here, as well as other initial claims. And further on later they went to Ararat and Stawell. This evening I want to provide a bit of context about these people and consider the drivers of why they came to Victoria and some of their enduring legacies. For me, these are the long-run metallic nerves of the rushes, so to speak. So the image here, some of you, well, you'll probably know the one to the Ford Maddox Brown one, and this is a picture. He was the Birmingham-based artist. He painted it of his friend Thomas Woolner and his wife, Sarah, and if you look carefully in her lap, there is the child, Catherine. It was painted in 1855, and I think it speaks to that moving of people. When he painted it, about 350,000 people were leaving England every year to migrate, and it tells the story of the people who were the gold generation. It's also technically beautiful. It was voted the 8th most popular picture in England recently, and Maddox Brown said that the bonnet took him 4 weeks to paint, so it's quite an extraordinary thing. I thought he was a pre-Raphaelite painter. He didn't actually identify as one as such, even though he was from Birmingham, but his friend Woolner, the sculptor, who was the subject of this picture, certainly was. And next to that is a picture of the Mount Alexander diggings, Mount Alexander Road, I beg your pardon. The same road I think that the Beatles would have come in from Essendon Airport. And that's on a friend of mine, Ben Bamford's book cover. But that's the story of the Chinese gold seekers and others making their way to the diggings as well. So who were these people that became the gold generation? Broadly speaking, they were young. Half of the international arrivals in the 1850s were aged between 21 and 35. And 2/3 of them were male. There was a gender spike, initially at least. Most of them paid their own way to Australia, although roughly 1/3 of them were assisted in their passage. Many were educated, and interestingly, by 1861, Victoria had the lowest rate of illiteracy in the world. So it was a very articulate and politically conscious community, which I think speaks more to what we'll talk about later on with Eureka. So they were educated, many were skilled, and only 1/3 of the British male immigrants to Australia were unskilled labourers, compared to 2/3 of migrants to the United States. In the words of Geoffrey Searle, who wrote The Golden Age, and one of those sort of 60s or 70s historians, along with Blaney and Weston Bate, that has books that have a shelf life of 50 or 60 years, the migrants from Britain during the first years of the gold rushes were something like a cross-section of Britain, with a thin slice off the top and a thick slice off at the bottom. As time passed and these young people grew older, the members of the gold generation went on to be hugely influential in the development of the cultural and political institutions in Victoria. They're a bit like baby boomers, I suggest. Searle they endure for a long time, you know. Searle points out that 9 out of 13 premiers for Victoria from the 1860s to the 1890s were members of this generation. And I'd also like to add, just thinking about it, I know it's in the forward of Blaney's Rush that never ended, and I'm sort of living a bit from this, that Bob Hawke, up to and including every Australian Prime Minister up to Bob Hawke in 1990, they'd either had a father, uncle or a grandparent, male or female, who had been on the Australian goldfields. And perhaps more significantly, Robert Menzies, Sir Robert, the longest-serving Australian Prime Minister, his maternal grandmother, Jessie Sampson, was his maternal grandfather, the father of his mother, Jessie Sampson, was a local president of the Preswick branch of the AMA, the Miners' Union. But he also had connections with Japarut as well, of course. So people headed to the Australian, particularly the Victorian goldfields, from all over the globe. Many migrants came from other countries during the rushes, and they later returned home. It was also typical of the mid-19th century New Zealand experience, where 1.4 million people migrated to the British Isles, from the British Isles, I beg your pardon, yet 1 million of those were Scots who returned home soon after or continued around the Pacific Rim. the return of the Chinese diggers to China, remembering at one point, and this is a census detail, 1 in 11 people in colonial Victoria came from southern China, particularly from the Siap and Toishan region of Canton. These people all were part of a historical phenomenon of ceaseless mass movements in people in the 19th century. These mass movement migration patterns, particularly those who come from the British Isles, are really one of the major trajectories of what happens in Victoria and then Australia. And implicit in migration is the idea of transition. So in this respect, a similar motivation for coming to Victoria is shared by people of all nations, hence the slide, women and men. Not only that, they come for a whole lot of reasons, but can I just ask you for a second to consider you're in the British Midlands, the Industrial Revolution's in full swing, you're maybe on wage rates, there's no 35-hour week, there's not a lot happening, you might have to work in care, or if you're a younger woman, there are not a lot of prospects, or you're in southern China during the Taiping Rebellion, where up to 35 million people might have died, might have been the bloodiest thing of the 19th century. The prospect of coming to Australia from these situations, or in Italy where there's a civil war going on in 1849, there are a whole series of failed revolutions, or you're simply just having a look and you're returning from California from whatever happened in the California rushes. It's not all doom and gloom, or you might be interested. But all of these people have to make a decision to come here and encounter gum trees, flora and fauna they've never seen, a very different relationship with water, and society that's going to be formed. And they're coming often from very settled societies. So I just sort of invite you to think about that migration motivational thing, because it's quite unbelievable when you think so many people came. Sure, some left, but so many stayed, and they created this society that we're in. Oh, don't open there. I got it, sorry. Okay, so in 1851, August 1851, gold was formally discovered in the newly formed state of Victoria, seemingly situated on the periphery of the British world during an era that many consider the height of the British Empire. With the news of the stunning gold strikes in late 1851, the era of Charles La Trobe took a radical change, and the new state of Victoria was soon to be vastly different to the one that there's a place that he'd worked so hard to establish since he'd been appointed the superintendent. Remember, they never made him governor of the Port Phillip district in 1839. The same year he'd arrived, in 1839, on the 30th of September with his wife and daughter, 2 servants, and as the Australian Dictionary biography tells us, a prefabricated house, he seemingly came prepared. Upon his arrival in Melbourne, La Trobe declared, make of this what you will, it is not by individual aggrandisement, by the possession of numerous flocks or herds, or by costly acres that people shall secure for the country enduring prosperity and happiness, but by acquisition and maintenance of sound religious and moral institutions without which no country can become truly great. So in a sense, the governorship or lieutenant governorship of La Trobe, often harshly judged by his contemporaries, presaged the less flexible era of Governor Sir Charles Hotham. The Eureka Rebellion, the critical moment, the crucible, the sustained peopling, to use Jamie Bellach's term, of Victoria from people from all over the world, and the development of Melbourne into what A.G.L. Shaw observed as one of the great cities of the British Empire. Remembering Melbourne was the first city in the world to have gas street lighting, so it really was modern for its time. So, the mid-19th century, and here's the stentorian face of Lieutenant Governor La Trobe in the background. I'll move on from him in a moment. Mid-19th century gold discoveries transformed Australia for sure, and this tumultuous epoch began with the crucial moment when the Englishman Edmund Hammond Hargreaves discovered gold at Summer Hills Creek, a little known, I wouldn't even know where it was, place in central western New South Wales. Hargreaves was both a goldfields pioneer and an opportunistic self-promoter. We all know them. He did not actually discover gold, although he quite deliberately set out to find it. One of the thousands of 49ers who had left for the Californian goldfields, he returned in 1851 to his old stomping grounds in the Bathurst district. And when he was there, he convinced some local stockmen to help him find alluvial gold, because he'd heard that there were rumours of gold had circulated for years. And ultimately, one of them led him to Summer Hills Creek. So Hargraves' contribution was to publicise the discovery in the colonial press against the express wishes of the New South Wales government, who had long suppressed gold discoveries for fear of potential law and order nightmares. To one observer in nearby Wellington, it seemed as though the whole frame of society, through the length and breadth of the land, became convulsed. The magnitude of these events was not lost on Hargraves. His discovery marked, according to him, a memorable day in the history of New South Wales. I shall be a baronet, and my old horse will be stuffed, put in a glass case, and sent to the British Museum. While Hargraves' hubristic tone marks him out as another chancer, typical of the era, his self-promotion belies a much deeper legacy, that of formally opening the era of gold discovery that commenced in 1851 and continued through a half a century to the fabled sands of Kalgoorlie and other Western Australian goldfields. Indeed, in some respects, as the historian Geoffrey Blaney later noted, I can't help myself, it was a rush that never ended. Okay. So the gold rushes are commonly regarded as a watershed in the history of colonial Australia, violently interrupting the gradual, steady growth of the Australian colonies. They tore the colonies away from their dependence on the staples of wool and wheat and created a new image that helped them distance themselves from their penal origins. They ushered in an era of major economic, social and political growth, obviously with long-term environmental implications. They helped shape the broader contours of Australian society. They gave mass migration from all over the world, that emergence of responsible government and remnant mining landscapes, as well as the legacy issues that are globally significant. The rushes not only defined the development of the goldfields region over the next 15 years, but it had a huge impact on the development of Australia in the second half of the 19th century. So, while the number claimed to have discovered gold in the colonies, the first discoveries almost certainly occurred in the 1840s, but as we mentioned a moment ago, were kept secret for fear of a social upheaval. And that, I think, the fear was that it would cripple the established pastoral squattocracy. Verified discoveries were officially rewarded with lucrative bounties from the state, essentially a finder's fee, meaning that the first of the goldfields not only fared best, but received an additional reward if their claim to discovery was upheld, though invariably such claims were contested. That the colonial authorities came to reward gold discoveries, I think, demonstrates their quick appreciation of the correlation between gold, economic growth, and community building. You're not going to have, you need the wealth, you need the money, you need the gold, but you also need to have a community. And these instant cities that Anthony mentioned, they're put up to try and reassure people because they're not really sure how long they're going to last for at all. They sound like they're amazing, they've been here forever. But in the early days, it was very unclear what was going to happen. And I think that probably speaks to the incredible civic buildings throughout the region relative to their scale. So arguably, it was at Clunes that I really didn't want to talk about this, I knew I was going to get in trouble, but arguably it was at Clunes that the first gold rush broke. Yet it was at Buninyong near Ballarat in 1851 that the official discovery in Victoria was made by Thomas Hiscock. This triggered the Victorian rushes. This is the main event. But sure, there's tin mining in Tasmania, sure, there's gold extraction in New South Wales, sure, there's tin mining in Burra, really important in South Australia, but the main event really is the Victorian rushes. And soon after the Ballarat discoveries by Hiscock in the region, a shepherd called Christopher Peters, a Barker's Creek hut keeper, discovered gold 50-odd miles to the east at Specimen Gully in the Vale of Mount Alexander. Although he also didn't disclose his winning because he thought he might get in trouble for appropriating so much illicit gold. Yet this was probably not the first gold discovery in the region, for it was widely rumoured that the nephew of William Campbell, the well-to-do squatter and member of the MLC and owner of Strathlodden Run, had found gold during the 1840s in Fry's Creek. However, like the shepherd McGregor in Wellington in New South Wales, the pastoralist family kept the knowledge secret. The Campbells were characteristic of the so-called squattocracy, or the Bunyip aristocracy, as some of you may know, the class of powerful pastoralists derided for their aristocratic pretensions in modelling themselves as landed gentry, and whose power extended to political domination of the upper houses of colonial parliaments. Their apprehension about the probable disruption to sheep grazing is understandable and was proven correct given the gold rushes that followed radically altered the land usage and settlement throughout the region. Unsurprisingly, William Campbell, whose Strathlodden Run was located on very rich gold-bearing ground on Campbell's Creek, was the most vociferous critic of the effects of the gold discovery. I just want to set this up as a contrast to Eureka, folks, so I'm sorry if it's a bit basic, but yeah. So his concern over the socially transformative nature of the rushes combined with the 1877 introduction of land taxation, led him to, quote unquote, retire to the old world, where communism is not so rank as it is here. In contrast, other squatters, probably a bit more realistic, on the Russia's areas, capitalised by selling produce and perishables. And ultimately, the pastoral industry boomed as the price for as the price for lamb and beef went through the roof, and that presented a quickly converted opportunity for vast profits. For many, the main attraction of gold seeking was the dream of obtaining rapid and immense wealth with limited assets. Jack and Jill, as good as their master and mistress, it is a possible ability to have transformation in class-bound or very traditional or very difficult social situations with a lack of mobility, say in China in the 1850s. This provided just a huge opportunity. This is the narrative of autonomy. And it certainly was the story at Ballarat during the initial stage, the first truly significant phase of the Australian gold rushes. For some of the very lucky first arrivals, the initial strike started where there was alluvial, easily won gold. This allowed the fortunate early miners, many of them I should say, not all, I understand it gets hard to diggings later on, it enables them to strike it rich almost instantly. This is very different from poor man's diggings where you toil away and hang in there. And later, Ballarat would remain in the popular imagination due to the welcome nugget weighing an incredible 69.98 kilograms and triggering a whole new rush upon its sensational discovery. Now, I am mindful that there are a number of experts in the room and people know Ballarat better than me. I know that the alluvial rush was kind of short-lived. I know that we go to deep lead mining company formation and that sort of sets Ballarat up on a much longer trajectory. But initially, I think it's true that you could win gold pretty quickly. And then the welcome nugget came along. Other places, such as Bendigo or Mount Alexander, for example, where vast reserves of alluvial gold also lay within 6 feet of the surface, captured the public imagination throughout the colonies and internationally. So by December of 1851, some 20,000 people had descended to Castlemaine, many from Ballarat before they returned straight away after the rushes ended. And the gold escort from the local diggings was reportedly bringing down the largest quantity of gold gathered in 1 week, yet received by any one conveyance in this or any other colony under the sun. Miners came to Ballarat and Alexander, and then later Bendigo, from the adjacent colonies of South Australia, New South Wales, and in many cases they were returning south. They'd already been drawn there for the Bathurst rushes in wake of Howgrave's discovery. Tasmania, which you could argue never really recovered from the depopulation that occurred as a result of the gold rushes. It's still got a very different historical trajectory than it did prior to 1851. Excuse me. And also from New Zealand, while many more, as mentioned a moment ago, endured the long and uncertain passage from other parts of the world. After the initial wave of British arrivals, other international gold seekers soon followed in great numbers, and they were also drawn by the twin prospects of material gain and individual autonomy. Some were no doubt lured by the panoramas and other tableaux depicting Australia and the gold rushes that toured Britain during this era. And I think Mimi Colligan wrote a great book about that. In later years, thousands more would follow after Victorian gold was displayed at the Great Exhibition of 1862. It's a huge gold pyramid. I'm sorry, I wanted to put a picture up, but I couldn't find a good enough resolution. But it obviously captures the imagination. So many of them were sojourners who returned home, and some stayed, but all had imaginations that have been captured by, in Manning Clark's words, the promise that all men, and I should say men and women, might one day acquire the wealth with which to become owners of property. So it's a settling story as well. Yeah. So it's also important to note that the Australian rushes were part of a key broader gold-seeking phenomena that commenced in 1848 at Sutter's Mill in California, continued throughout the Pacific Rim during the second half of the 19th century, and facilitating the populating of Victoria, settlement of California, that has a very similar sort of, San Francisco and Melbourne are very similar cities in some ways. They're both sort of mining hubs on the coast, and they lead up country to a series of very distinctive goldfield cities, in our case Ballarat and Bendigo, and I guess the obvious one is Sacramento in California, which is the capital as well. But they also came from other lesser known regions of New Zealand, the Cariboo in British Columbia, the Yukon, Chile, Peru, and then later South Africa. So that's what was populated as well as gold rushes. Victoria and New South Wales received over 600,000 new immigrants in the 1860s, and many of them descended into sites so remote and rugged in terms of bushland that they'd basically been left largely undisturbed by the early phases of pastoral settlement. But they were now quickly, seriously, and dramatically stripped and mined with terrible environmental consequences. And it has to be said also, this has huge implications for the First Nations people who never went away, have always been here, have endured. But just imagine, I invited you to think about the motivations for migration. We'll imagine the implications of the arrival of so many people in such a short period of time on your traditional land. It's just food for thought, make of it what you will. Makeshift towns sprang up overnight, sometimes disappearing soon after. New tracks were carved to provide access to the fields, which were soon teeming with carts transporting provisions and pedestrians carrying tools. The colonial authorities were clearly challenged and genuinely proved ineffectual in their responses to this massive influx of people in such a short period of time. And as some observers have suggested, the discovery of gold had caused the world to turn upside down. And interestingly enough, and there's a book being published recently in Bendigo, it's called Upside Down Country, and I think traditional communities, certainly the Jarjarung, I'm not sure if it's Wallarong as well, but they call the heavily mined area Upside Down Country. During the 1850s, the Australian diggings were a frontier containing endless social possibilities, albeit rife with serious racial and cultural problems. They were a contested space that initially defied definitive or successful regulation. What do you do in an emerging community? But they were typified by a high degree of social transformation that tended to invert the social order experienced in Britain or Europe or China. Perhaps not so much in America, where perhaps more was possible in a new society. Victorian goldfield centres at Ballarat, Castlemaine and Bendigo, for example, also became renowned as places of political and social dissent, as well as places where egalitarian notions of mateship and equality of opportunity flourished. Perceptions of the national character can be traced to the diggers, typified by the stereotype of bushy-bearded, self-reliant, hard-working miner whose manner independence was embodied. But that said, the work of Dot Wickham and Claire Wright, Heather Holst, and more recently Marjorie Theobald, has all argued that the role of women on the goldfields was far more pronounced than the previous historical narratives have discussed, and the debates of the gold-seeking experience have suggested. Their work reveals a more nuanced social reading and history of the Victorian gold rushes, or indeed the Australian rushes, but mostly Victoria they're writing about, and often they're writing about specific communities. And I think they offer a more nuanced social reading, but also a more richer take into the lived experience of the gold-seeking experience beyond sort of the initial formative, crews of diggers. Okay, so what I've got here is a slide. This is a precursor to the Eureka flag. Does anyone know what it is? And Derek, you can't say. Have a guess? Yeah, it is. They called it the Diggers flag. It's from it's the Chewton Domain Society, which are the local Chewton Friends group. It's their take on what they think was flying in this ham engraving in the background, which is a terrible resolution. You can kind of make it out. And so what's there is the pick and shovel for the miners, the phalanx of sticks for unity. It's not a fascist symbol. It just was, the scales of justice, and the emu and the kangaroo. Quite an early use of this, I think. And the reason for the emu and the kangaroo, they're two creatures that can't go backwards. So, folks, we can only go forward as Australians. Yeah, and then I just want to put in a picture of Grosse's lithograph of Castlemaine, because it's got the Chinese diggers and the Europeans all in the foreground. That's just, I thought, quite an interesting little contrast. This is where some of the agitation happened, which is obviously leading into Eureka. So that underlying camaraderie that I mentioned is particularly evident of the politicisation of the European miners on the Victorian goldfields. I think it's epitomised in the crucial iconic moments such as the Eureka Rebellion and the monster meeting at Fryers Creek of the 5th of December 1851, as well as the Red Ribbon Brigade in Bendigo. These were key acts of political dissent. I know a lot of people have thought about this more than me, so please get into me during the questions. I'm just going to offer my take on it for what it's worth. These were key acts of political dissent against the oppressive practices of an ill-equipped but obtrusive colonial administration. They had the immediate effect of forcing a reduction in the licensing fee so that the government in Victoria appeared, in the words of the London Times no less, to have been humbled in the dust before a lawless mob. But as discontent continued to simmer, it coalesced into a far more reaching set of popular grievances and the demand for universal male suffrage and the familiar call of no tax without representation. Much was owed here to the influence of Chartism. This is this transmission of ideas and these things, which H.C. Harris has described as an indirect undercurrent promoting faith in democratic methods and objectives, particularly concerning electoral reform. This is very radical for the 1850s, and I think, this speaks to the flag that's not far from here. The Chartist agenda for radical reform appeared to flourish in the Australian goldfields with their climate of egalitarianism and social transformation. Ernest Scott, the first founding chair at Melbourne Uni, argued that the agenda of the Ballarat Reform League, formed in late 1854 to voice the grievances and aspirations of the local miners, was essentially a local variant of Chartism modified for the Central Victorian context. Certainly, Chartist principles were central to the framing of the League's charter in 1854, which demanded equal laws and equal rights for the whole free community and the recognition of the people as the only legitimate source of all political power. On the goldfields, Chartist newspapers enjoyed very heavy circulation, nurtured political literacy, as did activists whose political consciousness and cultural positions were steeped in tradition and experience. The Italian Raffaello Carboni, for example, who had participated in the 1849, Roman uprising, and then fought against the restoration of papal power, and obviously the brother of Benito Carboni, the liberator of Italy, with Garibaldi, came to Victoria with more than a yearning for material benefit. Now, this is the property of a gentleman. Thank you for permission to reproduce it. This is, I've called it a manuscript, but I guess it's a book, isn't it? Sorry, it's a publication, but I've always thought it was a manuscript because Carboni's a witness to the Eureka Stockade, and just a really rare thing, held in private hands. What an amazing thing to look at, and I wanted to give you a feel. These people were really thinking about it. So the reform campaign that I'm talking about proved to be complex and prolonged, as well as violent, reaching its fabled climax in the clashes at Eureka, here, Ballarat, in December 1854. Only a few weeks after the framing of the League's charter, 6 soldiers who meant business, they're coming in, it's the British Army, the Redcoats, they know what they're doing, and 22 civilians died in the dawn raid on the Eureka Stockade. Around 200 men were subsequently arrested, with 13 alleged ringleaders singled out and charged with high treason, a very serious charge with incredibly dramatic and finite implications if found guilty. During a series of trials in the Victorian Supreme Court the following year, all the accused were acquitted by sympathetic juries, beginning with the African-American immigrant John Joseph, who now has a commemorative statue in Bendigo, and he was carried down from the court and led down Russell Street on the shoulders of a jubilant crowd. The violence and drama of these events have been central to the potency of the legend surrounding Eureka and have entrenched it as a seminal moment in 19th century Australian history. The mythology is also enhanced by the supposed outcomes of Eureka. In the ensuing months, amid a vastly different political climate, Governor Hotham instituted a commission of inquiry into the goldfields, a key publication, as well as a new constitution establishing responsible government in Victoria, which was passed by the Victorian Parliament. Thus, the licence fees were subsequently abolished, and Victorian men, well, not all Victorian men, some people didn't get the vote, the Chinese didn't get the vote, most of them, were given the right to vote, and certainly not women. The diggers lost their battles at Bendigo and Ballarat, but ultimately won the concessions and the grander aims to which they aspired. In the ensuing years, the miners played a key role in extending a reformist agenda that resulted in the 8-hour day. There's the Galloway Monument, not far from here at the bottom of Sturt Street, first claimed in Melbourne, 1856, not soon after here. Free education, trade unionism and the protection of working wages. And I'd like to suggest to you that if we're going to look at it as a long-term continuum, the suffragette petitions, for women's votes, And that's an amazing thing. If you have a chance to see it at the Prov, I think that marks sort of like the end of this first era of 19th century civic battles for civil or democratic rights. So that may be something you could take up in the questions, but I'd see it as a much longer thing, and I know other people have written about that or talk about it quite a bit. So the Eureka Stockade is thus regarded as a key moment in the move towards responsible government in Australia. Yet I'd suggest it's also contestable, and some have contended that its main outcome was to bequeath an established and amorphous rhetoric of democracy, which of course was not always translated into practice. That might be a bit mean, but it might be true. While Eureka is critically important and continues to occupy the central place in the Australian popular memory, debates will continue to rage over its significance. Was Eureka really a key moment in Australian democracy, or was it a riot by a bunch of unruly self-interested miners? Because too much or too little is claimed for Eureka in equal measure, I'd suggest that assessing its historical importance is really difficult for us, as any judgment on this very, very keenly felt episode, and it is a keenly felt episode. I should have put the next slide up just to make the point. Any chance to assess its significance is difficult because it's invariably informed by one's historical sympathies or our political persuasions. So here we have Dudier's swearing allegiance to the Southern Cross. Then I just couldn't help putting this up. I found this on the Historical Society website, and it's a great illustration of a commemorative statue, I guess, monument to the Eureka Fallen. So the community is very conscious. It's got very powerful words. You might want to read it later, and I can share the slides. And of course, here's the actual artefact. You know, the signature piece of material culture in, probably in Region Victoria. It's one of the national treasures, isn't it, of course. I think it's been expertly conserved here, Anthony. I hope you don't mind. I grabbed it from the website as well, but what a wonderful thing. The key point of this slide is, one, to give you a bit of a feeling for the flavour of the swearing of the allegiance to the cross. You know, what a potent moment. The community memory abiding, the keepers of the flame up to and including the present day. I know people in this room feel very, very strongly about it. And then, of course, the museological and just the conservation and the fact that it's still here and in such good condition, 170 years later, sorry, yeah. So just to sort of put it in a bit of context, okay? So I think it's too simplistic to suggest that the gold discoveries directly lead to democracy in Victoria, but they certainly help create social and political situations where representative government and democratic principles come to the fore. Gold, so I'm probably agreeing half with Western Bait here. Gold provides a set of social, cultural and economic opportunities that in many cases just simply wasn't available in mid-19th century Europe, industrial Britain, or for that matter, late Qing dynasty China. The Russias promoted the idea that the individual could make a fortune and gain financial and social autonomy, as we talked about. During the 19th century, Britain became one of the most politically sophisticated nations and in turn the most successful imperial power of the era. The discovery of gold had dramatic implications for the development of Australia within the British imperial framework. And although convict transportation to New South Wales ended in 1840, the discovery of gold effectively scuttled attempts to revive it, and the beleaguered system in Van Diemen's Land was inevitably dismantled. For Britain, colonial gold provided the capital reserves that supported the continuing industrialisation and economic power. And some have argued the amount of gold won from Victoria or Australia, but particularly from Victoria, provided the gold supply that kept the whole show running to the 1890s when there was a global recession. Such was the wealth of the place, and I think we see that in the built environment, and as Anthony mentioned in the lead up, the amount of cultural institutions that are punching above its weight. We have a hospital, we have a university, we have all these different things, we have museums and galleries that are purpose-built. And we're not alone, Bendigo's kind of similar, even Castlemaine. So the Russians created a new impression of Australia. The colonies were no longer regarded as ex-penal colonies and prisons, but rather places of opportunity, places of wealth, places of settling, places of community, employment and commerce. Later generations will make much of the idea that these new waves of immigration pushed the taint of convict ancestry, although I think it's quite, fashionable to have a convict ancestry now, but for a long time it was pushed into oblivion as the new foundation myth of European settlement in Australia emerged. And I mentioned the European vision they're still the Indigenous voice that needs to be heard, and I know others will talk about this. So, moving towards the end. What ensued is the massive gold discoveries in Victoria was a sensational chain of events that spread and expanded, leading ultimately to the rise in importance of the state within the empire, the colony, I beg your pardon. And prior to the discovery of gold, Victoria was a little-known and unremarkable pastoral backwater. The extraordinary economic and social consequences of the gold discoveries brought irreversible changes. Yet the story of the Australian gold rushes is not only one of wealth, fame and failure, but also the movement of people, as we talked about. But this irreversible changes, here we have, this is at Lawrence between Smeaton and Clunes, and that's the engine house, and I think it's part of the extended Madam Berry leads. I might be wrong if it's not Madam Berry, it's certainly very close by. Thank you to old friend Derek for finding a companion picture to the Daintree image that was on the blurb. This is Black Hill with the mine there. Quite an extraordinary image. But yeah, so I just think, and obviously the environmental impact is immense. It doesn't matter what we think about it, it's changed the landscape. I happen to like mullock heaps, but they are pretty serious, you know, and there is arsenic in the soil in many of our goldfield settlements. These are issues that we're trying to remediate, and there are still discussions around, and in terms of society, about coming to terms with the colonial encounter between European and Indigenous Australia in the gold rushes. So what ensured, is this transformation, Yet the story of the Australian rushes is not only one of wealth, fame and failure, but it's also this movement of people. The people who came to the Antipodes represented a cosmopolitan group, and the diggings became a kaleidoscopic place of cultural complexity and political dissent. The gold generation, as I talked about it with Geoffrey Searle, it dominated things for the remainder of the century. Now, can I just ask you, Carly, to come down for a second? Yes, you're in? Yeah. I'm going to have a little break before I just wind it up into the conclusion. I'm going to send 4, what do you call them, Carly? Artefacts, material culture, history objects. Can you pass them around? Okay, now, it'll be first in with the buzzer for a copy of Before Now, one of our postgraduate publications I was more proud of than most people. There's 4 things going around the room, and if you could jump in when I've finished, after an appropriate pause, because Anthony needs to cut the video, you can have a copy of this. And there's 4 things. So the question is, with the jar, what was in it? What was it for? With the long thing, what is it? What sort of rock is it? And with the little image, where is it? Okay? So just to wrap it up, friends. Okay, these are the legacy discussions. The Ballarat School of Mines. Melbourne Uni didn't have a big engineering department. I know the Melbourne Uni historians here tonight. Thanks for coming, James. It didn't have a big engineering department for a very long time. It's not a strong faculty because it was seen that engineering was done best in the schools of mines in the goldfields in Ballarat and Bendigo. Interesting fact, second oldest institution, James, is it? Tertiary education in Victoria? The School of Mines? Redmond Barry, wasn't Redmond Barry the president of here and the chancellor at Melbourne Uni, the hanging judge? Yeah, sorry, I've been thinking. We don't want to underemphasise the significance of the cultural and tourism. I mentioned that earlier in the piece today, the festivals, the events, the historical societies, the visitors to the visitor economy. Why do I mention this? Because this is here in Eureka Centre, these are the sort of places that most people have their encounter with the past. They don't come to a lecture like this, they don't read a big book, they come in and they live in the past through a museum experience. Okay, and finally, to conclude, and here we have the 3 great cities, or I think the 3 great cities. Sorry, no, 2 great cities and Beechworth. I love Beechworth, but but here we have Ballarat, obviously the fair maiden, the great goldfield city, and certainly the one that's laid out the best. Bendigo with the view down View Street, and of course Beechworth, which is everyone's favourite place, and it costs $1 million to buy a house there now. They all speak, I think, to that diagonal corridor of the Goldfields region. There's other places that we can mention as well. Apologies to Maldon, Castlemaine, Ararat. Sorry, I've forgotten somebody, Talbot. But I really think that Ballarat and Bendigo really speak to a built form, a settlement pattern, a wealth creation, a radical transformation of the landscape that really define the gold rushes and these legacy issues that I'm talking about. So, to conclude, this presentation had been firmly grounded with a particular region. Its findings can be explained in terms of broader national and international mid-19th century historical phenomena. The significance of the key cities and towns of the region ultimately needs to be explained in terms of the presence of gold. Chain migration patterns that drew so many to the Australian goldfields occur because of a familiar cultural and economic pathway being opened up by the discovery of large alluvial gold deposits and then later the heavy mining. In essence, gold was the initial catalyst for attracting the people, and they stayed. It was a conduit and an enabler rather than just being democratic. The chain patterns developed in response to the demands on the goldfields. In this respect, the dynamics of the pull factors that sustained immigration were essentially the same for the English and Chinese as they were for the Welsh, the Irish, the enduring Swiss and Italian community around Daylesford and Yandoit, and other minority communities that ventured to the region to go gold seeking. I'm mindful that there's a synagogue not far from here. They came from everywhere, of all faith and persuasion. So as Henry Chan, the late Henry Chan, and David Goodman, who wrote that great book, Gold Seeking, have both argued when discussing the migration experience, it is unusual for people to leave from somewhere else. And I think we discussed that earlier. What are the motivations? So finally, perhaps because of the key legacy of gold rushes, it was their ability to enrich and transform, not just the built environment, but society. It is for this broader reason of the long-term impact of gold on the development of 19th century Victoria that the Victorian rushes are just so significant. So, while Edmund Hammond Hargraves did not receive his baronetcy and his horse never made it to the British Museum, his posthumous fame resides in his role as a key catalyst for Australia's golden age. Thank you.